Hey, folks, we are almost at the finish line here. We've got, what, 3 or 4 chapters here. Um, this is where things start to kind of come to a head, although, like I said in the last video, there's not one big kind of blow up moment that happens. So, of course, we have to look at all of these subtle clues to kind of see what happens. Um, and with that, we'll kind of jump into it. Chapter 22, when Phoebe asks Holden, what does he like? What does Holden think of? What does he actually answer? The implication there is that there are two different answers. Something he thinks of and then something he actually answers. And what does it mean that his thoughts go one way and his answer is another? Um, first of all, just the idea that he doesn't say what he thinks, that sort of self-censorship. He's kind of almost even distancing himself from even himself. He's not being truthful. He's not being honest necessarily. We'll go over that in just a second. So Holden first thinks of two things. First, the nuns that he saw in Grand Central. And again, that kind of the way he thinks of them as genuine and has more respect for them than any of the other phonies that he's encountered otherwise. And then another student named James Castle, who gets into a fight and ultimately kills himself, commits suicide. Again, his thoughts going towards suicide. Um, and that's what he likes. Um, which again is an odd and morbid thought. Um, so, but his answer, what he says, is that he likes Allie and he likes talking to Phoebe. Um, his first thought, his reaction to the question, is perhaps more genuine, is that of people dedicating their lives to a higher way of living and for some reason suicide, which again, there's that weird kind of dichotomy um, going there. Um, and well, once we get into what is it, something that Mr. Antolini says to him in chapter 24, that might actually make more sense what those thoughts are and what that means. Um, one can be very childish, and one can be, I think in this case, very childish, and the other being the sign of maturity and adulthood. And so again, those two things show that he's right in the middle there of going from childhood to adulthood. Um, let's see. Oh, and the obvious thing, what he says, what makes him happy is Allie and Phoebe, both children, both in childhood, both kind of innocent, both smart, both, all of those things that he likes and values. Um, and so again, there's a disconnect there between what kind of his genuine answer is or his genuine reaction is versus what he's saying. Again, it would be easy to go, oh, he's being phony. But I think it's a lot more than that. So let's continue on. What is Holden saying when he tells Phoebe he wants to be the catcher in the rye? He's not simply saying he wants to catch children before falling off a cliff. Now, we've gone over this idea several times. This is really the first time that Holden is, I guess, inward enough to know exactly what his conflict, well, maybe not exactly, but he has an idea of what his problem is, which actually is kind of growth. Um, Certainly from what we read of him in the first few chapters. Um, like I said, as I think most people have figured out, Holden wants to save children from falling off the cliff being adulthood. He wants to keep children innocent, even though it is pretty much inevitable that we all kind of grow up, we all experience things, we all become more mature. Um, Again, but it's not just the symbol there. It's but it's also Holden being aware enough of himself, of his own issues, essentially of his own fear, that he's now not only realized it, but is actually verbalizing it to at least Phoebe. Um, that might have been one of those points in his life where, uh, he says it and then he kind of realizes it after it's being said out loud, that type of thing. Um, which is interesting because we get into chapter 3, which there's a little part there that's really quite significant. In chapter 23, Holden visits Phoebe at home. He's actually already had been visiting her for a while now. After giving Phoebe his hunting hat, Holden begins to cry. Why is this the moment he cries? You'd think he'd cry at other times during the book or during, flashback things. But why now? Why with this hat? Um, Again, the symbol can be interpreted a bit differently, depending on how you interpret the hunting hat itself. For the most part, Holden's red hunting hat is a symbol of Holden's individuality, and kind of his separation of people and society. It is, in many ways, a security blanket too. Um, he puts it on when he wants to kind of be reminded that he's not one of those other normal people, of those phonies. Um, so by giving it to Phoebe, he's basically telling Phoebe to retain and to keep that individuality and that sense of kind of being separate from everyone else and don't grow up to be phony and things like that. Um, Holden knows how difficult it is as he's growing up and becoming an adult because he's doing it right then when he's writing or thinking of this. Um, and as a security blanket, he's giving it to Phoebe to make sure, again, she's protected. Um, and again, as hard of a time as Holden is taking it, um, that's kind of how he knows, well, this sucks. Adulting is hard. And so he gives his security blanket to Phoebe, in hopes that she'll kind of have a better time or an easier time doing it. I'm pretty sure she will. Um, and so knowing that, and again, not even realizing it, just knowing that the hat is special to Holden gives Holden this all the feels, if you will, to put it in modern terms. um and that's what kind of wells up in him, and he begins to actually cry at this. So it may even be an admission that he is becoming um, an adult and losing that innocence that he's been trying to protect for everyone else. And that's part of that weeping as well. Okay, last two questions are this scene with Mr. Antolini. Um, when Holden and Mr. Antolini begin to talk about expulsion from Pensy Prep, Holden complains about his debate class's rules and defends liking digressions, um, basically being distracted. How does Mr. Antolini react? / what does he say? What does this conversation show us about how Holden is progressing towards institutionalization? What does Mr. Antolini warn Holden of if he does not focus on his classes and future? Um, Big thing, the kind of ominous thing is Mr. Antolini warns that Holden is in for a big fall. which of course we know that as knowing where Holden kind of ends up and begins the book. Um, Mr. Antolini can see Holden's spiraling, and he says, and this is the interesting part, the part that I was referencing in number one. Mr. Antolini says, the mark of an immature man is that he wants to die for a noble cause, while a mature man wants to live humbly for one. Again, in number one, talking about Phoebe's question of what do you like, Holden thinks of first the nuns, then the classmate who committed suicide. The mark of an immature man is that he wants to die for a noble cause, while a mature man wants to live humbly for one. Living humbly for a cause is very much what the nuns are doing. The classmate who committed suicide after the fight is pretty much dying for a noble cause even as an individual goes. So, again, all of this is kind of showing how Holden is kind of spiraling and getting worse and kind of having more extreme thoughts, more extreme behaviors. And I think Phoebe sees it. Obviously, Carl not only saw it in the previous chapter, but saw it even before kind of the events of Catcher in the Rye, as that was not the first time. He told Holden to see his father. And so again, it's kind of building to this crescendo here, of which this conversation tires Holden out, and Holden becomes tired and falls asleep on Mr. Antolini's couch. Holden wakes up in a situation that is odd, keeping in mind that Holden is an unreliable narrator, and also his hangups and immaturity about sex. Do you think Mr. Antolini was actually gay and flirting with Holden, or do you think Mr. Antolini is just comforting a very troubled teenager who is headed for a fall? Give reasons for your ideas. For the most part, I'm going to leave that up to kind of your interpretations. Although as a teacher, I'm probably going to be a bit biased, and as you might expect, I would land on the side of a teacher being concerned for the student. Unfortunately, I have had, and when I say unfortunately, not for me, I've had students who have had and experienced great psychological trauma and events that has certainly come out in their classwork and their responsibilities. And so I certainly know what it's like to see someone go through that and to care about their well-being and not want them to continue spiraling downward. So I don't know. I mean, again, I've been in classes where people have argued both ways. I would say this, that even if Mr. Antolini is gay, um, it obviously bothers Holden. I think for us readers, the modern readers here, we don't really care too much. Certainly not that Mr. Antolini's gay. Holden's already been, kicked out of classes, so there's no conflict there. There is the conflict of he being Holden is underage. That's a problem, um, as Mr. Antolini most likely is not. Um, and so, yeah, it may be a problem for Holden, and even then, it may not even be an actual problem. It may be his misinterpretation of it. All right, so that's it for that chapter. We've got just 2 more chapters left, and that'll be the one reading assignment. And so next time you see one of these videos, it'll be the end of Catcher in the Rye. So I will see you there.